Thanks so much. I'm really thrilled that this was available for me to join virtually on such short notice. I'm going to go ahead and share the slides here. Hopefully you can see them. It's 9 p.m. here, or a little bit past. I don't have good lighting set up for this time of night. So I apologize that I'm a bit in the shadows here. And I was telling my children that I was giving a virtual talk in Australia, and all they wanted to talk about was Bluey, which is very popular in our house. So I'm really excited to talk with you today because I have spent several years thinking about exactly the questions that Gordon has teed up for us, related to how can we go about evaluating, well, in the US we call them IRBs, but I think all of the same principles are applicable in the context of HRECs. How can we figure out whether they are achieving quality? The kind of short answer is we can't do it quantitatively, but we still can find appropriate ways to hold IRBs and HRECs accountable, and to make sure that they're achieving quality standards. So I'm going to introduce you to a concept of reasonableness. Those of you who are lawyers in the audience will be very familiar with this, but I think it's quite useful in this context. So I think it's pretty clear what research ethics committees are supposed to be doing, right? We know the purpose for which they were created and the goals that they're trying to achieve. Most importantly, they're expected to protect research participants. And increasingly in the US, and presumably also where you all are practicing, there's attention to the communities from which research participants are drawn, right? So that's one really critical purpose that they are intended to serve. Ideally, they also can help promote important research, right? One way that you could protect participants is by saying, nope, we're not going to allow any research to proceed. That would be very bad. And so we need to have boards that are able to push good ethical research forward as quickly as possible. And then ideally, if we can achieve goals 1 and 2, we will also be training researchers to think through ethics questions on their own and raise them with IRBs and HRECs to get expert feedback and opinions. And it will be less, oh, I've got to get this, I've got to get approval, right? Someone else is going to think about the ethics. We want to train them to be paying attention to those ethics questions themselves. And 1, 2, and 3 together, if we're successful, can promote trust and trustworthiness in the research enterprise. Those things I think are pretty clear. So why is it so hard to evaluate whether IRBs and HRECs are doing a good job? And the reason is because the ability to define and measure quantitatively those factors that I was just mentioning, they're very subjective, right? They're very squishy and amorphous. And just to take one obvious example, if we say, well, we exist to protect research participants, you get into lots of questions. Well, what does it mean to protect participants? You can't protect them against all adverse events. Research comes with some risks. Maybe you can protect them against avoidable adverse events. Well, what counts as avoidable, right? These things are hard definitionally. And so even though we know what the outcomes of interest are, we haven't been able to nail down really concrete definitions. And if you can't define something clearly, it becomes very hard to measure it clearly. And the result is that we have a system in place globally, really, right? Everybody has some version of this as a core requirement for ethical research. It takes a lot of resources, a lot of time, and a lot of burden, but we don't have strong evidence that this system is achieving the goals that it was created to achieve. Now, by adopting any kind of research ethics oversight system, the assumption is that the burdens of that system are going to be outweighed by the benefits of that system, right? All of those goals that I was mentioning before. The tricky thing is it's really easy to measure burden. It's really easy to measure when things are a pain in the neck or when things go wrong. You can see those things and you can evaluate them quantitatively. So in the US at least, we have lots of data about inconsistency and variation between boards. You could talk to any researcher about how inefficient the system is, or redundancy, having to go to multiple boards at different institutions in the US. Boards asking bureaucratic questions rather than things that actually seem to matter to research participant protection. To Gordon's points, are the right experts around the table? Are they actually messing up the science because they don't understand it? Are they being overly conservative? I mean, our literature is filled to the brim with empirical data on these kinds of burdens and concerns, but it's much harder to evaluate the good things about this system. And the reasons for that are many, but one obvious thing is that it's much harder to evaluate the quality of a preventative intervention, which is exactly what IRBs and HRECs are. They are intended to prevent bad things from happening. And so when the bad things don't happen, is it because the IRB did a really good job, or is it because the researchers already knew what they were doing, or is it because in no universe was a bad thing going to happen in this particular type of study? So those benefits, I think they're there, but they're really hard to nail down and they're really hard to show empirically. But because we can't measure those benefits, as I was saying before, it's really difficult to know whether any single ethics committee is doing a good job, and it's even harder to know whether the system as a whole is doing a good job. It becomes difficult to evaluate quality across types of ethics committees. In the US, we have university IRBs, we have commercial IRBs, which are increasingly run by private equity entities, right? And so there's a question, which model is better? How would we know? It's hard to compare them kind of in an apples to apples way. So we have a lot of complaints, but we're unable to kind of prove that IRBs are achieving their goals. This does not mean that we have stopped trying to collect metrics about IRB performance. What we have done in the US is say, well, we know the IRB is doing a good job if they comply with the regulations, or the fewer researcher complaints, the better, or their turnaround time is really fast, right? But the problem with each of those measures is that not a single one of them is the reason that we have built this system, right? We didn't create ethics committees so they could just say, look, we checked the box, or look how fast we go, right? We created them to achieve a substantive purpose around ethical participant protection. So I don't mean to suggest we can ignore compliance. We all have rules and laws that we have to follow, and we want to do that as quickly as possible. But at least in the US, our regulations are not ethically comprehensive. For example, they say nothing about obligations to trial participants once trials have been complete. They say nothing about return of results. They say barely anything about paying research participants. And in the areas where they do touch, there's wide room for discretion. And so if you have all of that ability for variation, it becomes hard to say what counts as quality in terms of compliance. Talking about efficiency is also one of my pet peeves, because to be efficient means that you do a good job as quickly as possible. But if you don't know what counts as a good job, then you can't really say that you've done something efficiently. And increasingly, I've been latching on to a concept that a colleague of mine pointed me towards in the sociology literature, which is a very rich literature about something called audit culture, which I think would be very familiar to those of you who are doing work on ethics committees. And this, we see it in the context of education, for example, where you evaluate teachers based on the test scores of their students rather than on the substantive understanding that their students build through the teachers' lessons. So the idea of audit culture is that the metrics become the goal in and of themselves, rather than achieving the underlying ethical goals that the metrics had been intended to evaluate, right? So you're kind of changing the goalposts, and you're focusing on these evaluation metrics rather than the substantive goals. So we focus on these bureaucracies, we focus on whether we're achieving compliance, even sometimes at the expense of ethics. I don't know if you all use the acronym CYA, so I'll lose my couth for a second. But like in the US, we talk about cover your ass consent forms, which are, 20 or 40 page long documents that go through in just robust detail everything that could conceivably happen to somebody. That is not achieving the ethical goal of making sure people understand what they're getting themselves into and they understand the most important information before they decide whether to participate in research. But it meets the regulations, and so that's why we do it, right? So we want to avoid that kind of audit culture. The other tricky thing that happens when we can't evaluate quality in a meaningful way is that there's a tendency towards conservatism, where you'll have ethics committees say, well, we better be really, really careful because, if we let the bad thing go through, that will be obvious to everyone. It's less obvious if we, hold things up a little. If we behave in a more conservative fashion, we're less likely to kind of get dinged or be responsible for something bad happening to someone. And then the last thing I'll mention is a concern about self-assertion. When you have IRBs or HRECs who can't say, look at we look at these quality metrics that we achieve, one thing that they end up doing is saying, look, we found problems in the research. You asked us to look at the research. You asked us to evaluate the ethics. We found some problems. See, it's important that we exist. Even if the research was pretty good to begin with, and it was, meeting ethical criteria, if your job is to find problems, you're going to find problems. And that becomes really frustrating to researchers. So what I wanted to present to all of you is a new theory about quality that Aereo, which I'll mention in just a minute, has been pursuing over the past couple of years. And this is the proposal that we really just need to ask whether ethics committees are behaving reasonably. And the reason for that is because what they're asked to do are apply standards, not rules. So the difference between rules and standards, again, is familiar to, I'm a lawyer, right? Also like Gordon, by training, this is something familiar to those of us in law, but there are different approaches to policymaking. So rules are things that are very bright lines. They're not flexible. You don't need some third party to tell you what the rule means in a particular fact-based circumstance. So, the speed limit, you know exactly what it is. If you go over a particular number, you are violating the rule. The voting age, it's not open to interpretation. Even if I actually don't know what the voting age is where you all are. In the US, it's 18. Even if you are the most mature 16-year-old, you're not allowed to vote. Even if you are the least mature 20-year-old, you are allowed to vote, right? Bright line rules. Standards, on the other hand, are very flexible. They're open-ended. They often involve balancing tests or points to consider. They require judgment based on the particular facts and circumstances that are present in a given case. So in the US, we think a lot in disability law, for example, about whether a particular accommodation is reasonable in terms of what the employer's resources are, for example. Or in the context of medical malpractice or tort law, we ask, did this person provide reasonable care compared to others in a similar situation? You actually don't know what the standard is until you have the facts that you can combine with the standard, and then you put out the judgment. And that is exactly what ethics committees are tasked with doing. They apply standards, not rules. In the US regulations, you can see in the quotes here on the one side of the slide, under the regulatory examples, these are all standards. What does it mean for risks to be minimized? What does it mean for risks to be reasonable in relation to benefits, or for consent to be adequately informed? Those are concepts that are going to mean different things to different people. They're going to apply differently to different cases. You really need to have those facts in front of you. And then more broadly, right, all of the ethical requirements for research, we see standards come up again and again. Because we are tasked with applying standards, it's simply not helpful in most cases to ask whether the ethics committee got the right answer. There are many right answers in these situations. So, we can look at ends of the spectrum and say, look, everybody would agree this is the right approach, or everybody would agree this is the wrong approach. But in the middle of that spectrum, there's going to be a lot of reasonable disagreement. And I've already mentioned this in the context of medical malpractice. It's not a totally new concept. How do we know if the ethics committee did a good job? Well, what would another reasonable ethics committee have done in that situation, right? And this is also how we evaluate analogous decision makers like judges and juries. We can't ask, did they get the right answer? Because we don't actually know what the right answer is. So instead, we ask things of judges, for example, like, did they evaluate all the evidence that was presented? Did they look to precedent and apply it consistently? Those are the kinds of questions that we ask to evaluate quality in those circumstances. And that's the proposal, that we can do exactly the same thing in the context of IRBs. We can say, look, if their approach was reasonable, then we have to be satisfied with the outcomes that they achieve. How could you do better than reasonable, right? You can't ask someone to do more than that. That's all they're really capable of. And the other related thing to keep in mind here is when we think about the job that ethics committees have, they really are offering a type of procedural rather than substantive protection. What we have here are a group of independent experts who are separate and apart from the research team. And they are coming together to evaluate whether the research is ethically acceptable, keeping at the front of their minds the participants' rights and welfare. What they're really doing is promising research participants that what they're being asked to engage in is meeting some standard of ethical acceptability. So reasonableness is the key outcome of interest. Now, I didn't have enough time to go into a lot of detail about this, but there's quite a bit of writing about ethics committee quality. And there's one body of literature that says the best we can do with IRBs is evaluate their process and structure. And then there's another set of literature that says, no, it can't just be about process and structure. We have to know, what do they actually achieve? And we need to evaluate them based on their outcomes. For example, do they actually protect research participants? What I'm proposing is that reasonableness is falling kind of in between those two things. One way we can evaluate reasonableness is to look at the structure and process of these boards, but achieving reasonableness, in fact, tells us whether the outcomes are reasonable. So imagine that you have what looks to be a reasonable process, but research participants' rights are violated in some way. That could be a signal that something happened outside the ethics committee's purview, that you approved a protocol, but then the researchers went off the rails and they didn't follow what the protocol said, or they didn't follow the requirements that the research ethics committee put in place. That's not something that we can lay, the fault at the feet of the research ethics committee. Or it could be that something terrible happens to a participant and you say, wow, you know what? Their process that the board used here really was unreasonable. But what often is going to happen is that when things happen in research that we think are problematic, it's not going to be clear that the ethics committee did anything necessarily wrong. And we're going to end up needing to use those cases to engage in further deliberation about what research ethics in fact demands, right? We're going to need further deliberation to clarify what's reasonable. So I'm wrapping up in just a minute, but kind of the key takeaway here is that the work of evaluating quality in this space is to figure out, what are the elements of reasonableness? What would it take for us to say that HREC or that IRB was reasonable? And this is the kind of work that Aereo is doing now. So this is a graphic from a recent grant proposal that we put in. The idea, right, the bottom kind of foundation of this graphic are achieving core goals of participant protection and facilitating high quality research. what are the pillars of quality that are going to help us say that the IRB was reasonable? Well, a reasonable IRB needs to engage with researchers, for one. Those are the people whose work is being affected by their oversight. And they need to engage with communities from whom participants are drawn, right? The people who are going to take on the risks and burdens of research and be affected by research. They need to have adequate expertise, right? Scientific expertise, ethical expertise, and there are various ways of evaluating that and improving that. They need to achieve high quality deliberation. Now, there are some types of ethics committee reviews that just involve a single decision maker. But for the most part, for the harder stuff that we ask these committees to do, the goal is to bring a diverse group of people to deliberate together, to bounce ideas, to debate, and to come up with a better ethical decision than any individual would be able to come up with on their own. So how can we evaluate the quality of the deliberation that's happening? And finally, a reliance on precedent, meaning that you learn from what you've done before. And if you want to deviate from that, you need to have a good reason for doing so. So the idea is that these pillars help support the concept of IRB reasonableness. And I just want to flash up on the screen for 1 second. We have not, don't think that I have the answer for you on a silver platter just yet. We don't know exactly what the elements are going to be that indicate quality along each of these pillars. But what we're eventually envisioning is a quick snapshot. It's not quantitative. It will still be qualitative. And this is kind of on a traffic light system where, if you just take a look at the expertise column. Imagine there are several domains relevant to achieving strong expertise amongst your research ethics committee. Maybe you're doing really well on a couple of those elements, so those get marked green for your ethics committee. Maybe you're improving, but you haven't reached kind of the highest quality that you can. Those would be yellow. And then there might be an element or two where you think, wow, we haven't given that any attention at all, or we're really falling behind, right? Those would be your red elements. And so the work that Aereo is doing is trying to define, right, what are the component elements, and then come up with interventions that can help achieve quality across all of those. So I'll just flash up. This is the last slide. This is the consortium that Lisa mentioned, and Lisa is a member of, called the Consortium to Advance Effective Research Ethics Oversight. And you're welcome to take a look at our website. And we've got all of our publications posted there, which I hope you'll find useful.